Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mir Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Chaf Dalid Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very bottom line of Kuf Chaf Gimel Amid Beis, bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Tes Vav Sif Vav. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanesunim Ba'Tzara U'Ba'Shivya. Our learning should be a schus for Chaylei Yisrael. The Roman should give all of them a refuah shalema b'soich shar Chaylei Yisrael. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. Chaylei Yisrael b'soich shar Chaylei Yisrael. The Roman should bring a refuah shalema to all those that are chaylim. The Roman should watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. We are continuing to learn the halachas that pertain to creating an oyel arai, some kind of a temporary tent situation. Says the Mechaber Sivav, Kishemisadrim chaviyos zu al gabe zu, achas al gabe shtayim. Were you to be arranging barrels so that you're putting down two barrels and then you're going to put a third barrel perched on top of the other two in the middle. So what you're doing essentially is like this. Here we have our barrels. We have one barrel. We have two barrels. Now we're going to put up a third barrel. Now you'll notice that when we put up the third barrel, essentially we are roofing over this area. Now don't pay any attention. It doesn't really matter. The fact that this top cup is hollow, not negeya, but we don't even have to think about it in those terms. So if you will, let's say you did it that way. Bottom line is you are constructing an oyel arai because by putting up the top barrel, you are roofing over this area here between the lower two barrels. Now, if you follow the math, based on what we've learned until now, what you're doing here is you're creating an oyel arai. It is an oil that is not also lahagen. Your intent is not to create a shelter in this gap between the two lower barrels, so it's certainly not an oil that's also lahagen, but it is an oyel arai. Now, if you do this in the typical order, so if you put up your mechitzas first, well, the two lower barrels are what creates the mechitzas, the walls of this gap. Now you take the top chavis and you put it down. Now you created the gag. So now you have an oyel arai that's not osir lahagen. You've got mechitzas on the bottom, and you've built it kisidron. You built it in the normal order. You did the mechitzas and then you did the roof. So there would be strong reason here to say that this is asr. Now we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, there is one missing piece of information, and that is that in order for this to be asr midrabanan, you need one more factor. That is, there has to be some point, there has to be some tzorich, some need for this area that is being roofed over. In this scenario, what is the need for that area? Does it have any tzorich whatsoever? The Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us this, yes, it does. The tzorich is that apparently when you stack barrels of wine, it is important that there should be ventilation around the barrels. Somehow, if you don't have ventilation around the barrels, that could bring the wine to spoil. And therefore, there is a tzorich to this gap. The tzorich is a ventilation area. So you have here all the variables. It's an oyel arai, even though it's not also lahagen, it should still be also midrabanan because it has mechitzos. You built it in the proper order. You made the mechitzos and then the roof. And there is a tzorich, there is a purpose and a need to that lower enclosed area. Now let's see it inside. Based on all the above, said the Mechaber, if you're arranging barrels, one on top of the other, and you're going to do two on a lower level, and then one perched in between them on top, the way you have to do it is, what you have to do is, you have to hold the upper one up in the air, not on top of anything. You have to hold the top one up, and then you have to put the bottom ones in place, because then you're not doing it kiseder. Then you're not doing it in the normal order of events. You're doing the roof before the mechitzos, and since it's an oyel arai that's not asir lahagen, it is going to be mutter. Aval, however, says the Mechaber, Lo yisader hatachtonos tchila, you cannot put up the bottom ones first, v'yaniach elyon alein, and then place the top one up above, because then you are doing it kisidron, and then it would be aser midrabanan. Says the Mishnah Kan Chavtes, Lo yisader mishum da'avid ke'ein oyel, because if you do the bottom ones first and then the top one, then you're constructing it in the normal way of constructing an oyel. By putting later the top one up on top. So you're placing a roof on top of mechitzos that you constructed first. Now, even though we still need that the lower enclosed area should have some point to it, there has to be a tzarech to that bottom area. There is a tzarech. You need the airspace between the barrels. Because either the barrels would get moldy or somehow the wine would spoil if there was no ventilation around the barrels. Moving along to Sif Zayin, top line, Chav Dalet Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber. Interesting halacha. Mutar lahaniach sefer echad mikan. You're allowed to place one sefer over here, ve'echad mikan, and another sefer over here, ve'echad al gabehen, and another sefer on top. So what the Mechaber is telling me over here is, you could take 3 svarim. So you take one sefer like this. Here, let's move the microphone a little bit out of the way. You take one sefer like this, you take another sefer like this, and you take a third sefer like this. You're allowed to stack up svarim in this fashion, even though what you've just done is you've created one mechitza, you created a second mechitza, and then you created a roof over the area underneath. So you created an oil arai. Certainly, it's an oil that's not osir lahagain. It's an oil arai. But again, if there's any kind of tzarech for that area underneath the roof, right? And if you do it kisidron, you would think that the math would tell us that there's room for this to be also midrabanan. Yet, the Mechaber tells us that this is very, very mutter. And that's going to bring us to a very important Ramah. So let's see this again here in the Mechaber. Mutter lahadiach sefer echad mikan vechad al gabein. This is mutter. You're allowed to put one sefer on one side, one sefer on the other side, and another sefer on top. And the Ramah explains why. Haga. Because in this case, there is absolutely no purpose to the open area that is being roofed over. In the case of the wine barrels, we said there's a purpose. The barrels need ventilation. Over here, the svarim do not require ventilation. You're not putting or storing anything under there, so there's no point whatsoever to that gap, that airspace that's being roofed over by the top sefer, and therefore this is mutter. Says the Mishnah Kat Lamed Echad Mikan. Now the Mishnah makes a very interesting tangential point over here. Says the Mishnah V'hainu dafka kishetzarech lilmaid mishnehem. This halacha that you're allowed to arrange the svarim this way is only if you need the svarim. You need all 3 of these svarim. I mean, okay, you could see some of what's going on my desk over here. You can't really see the surface of my desk, but you can see here my stender. So I've got a Shulchan Aruch over here, and I've got another Shulchan Aruch over here, and I've got another Sefer over here. I've got over here I've got an Aruch HaShulchan opened, and over here I've got a Dirshu Mishnah Berurah open. I've got a lot going on over here on this desk. There's an Igros Moshe, there's a Maftech to the Igros Moshe, there's a Sefer Tehillim. So when I'm preparing, when I'm learning by my desk, I am very often using copious amounts of svarim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, when the Mechaber tells us that you're allowed to stack svarim in this way, says the Mishnah Berurah, that's only if you're using these svarim. So, for example, over here, I've got svarim stacked up. The reason I've got these svarim stacked up is because I'm using all of these svarim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, yeah, you could stack the svarim in this way if there's a point, because you're learning from the svarim. Or The reason the Sfarim are stacked that way is because even if I'm not using all of these Sfarim right now, but very often when I say shir, you see that there are closed Sfarim here on the stender. So if I used Sfarim yesterday and I closed them, and they're sitting here on my stender, I could take another sefer and I could put it on top of those two Sfarim, open it up, and learn from it. And that's absolutely mutter. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, but if not, if the Sfarim aren't here because I'm using them, or because I used them previously and now they happen to be on the desk, even if the reason you're bringing a sefer here, right? I have over here, here's my Mishnah Berurah I'm saying share from, and I have one of these, nifty folding stenders that I use to elevate my sefer. Now, let's say I didn't have this. So let's say my Mishnah Berurah was flat on the desk, and now I decided that I wanted to elevate my sefer. Would I be allowed to go and take these two Sfarim? This happens to be a Medrash Rabbah with a very beautiful Pirush, the Pirush of the Tiferes Tzion, an unbelievable Pirush on Medrash Rabbah. Would I be allowed to now take these two Sfarim, put them down on the desk, and use them to hold up my Mishnah Berurah? Says the Mishnah Berurah, you would not be allowed to do that. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even if you want to take a sefer to elevate your sefer so that you could learn from it, yesh bezayin l'sefer atachton. That would be a bezayin to the sefer that you're using as a stender. Va'af b'choil aser. And even during the week, forget Hilchos Shabbos, forget creating an oil arai. Even during the week, this would be aser because of bezayin HaTorah. He brings this from a Taz. Avol b'magen Avram simikuf todal mitzadit lahater v'chein b'chay adam b'chlal lamed aleph sif memches kasav diyesh lahater. I believe Rav Moshe, I remember seeing in a tshuva in the Igris that the Yeshiva Zatzal paskin also that this is mutter. However, I took a quick look in the Igris, I couldn't find it now. So let's just be clear of what the Mishnah Berurah just told us. The Mechaber, from the perspective of Hilchos Shabbos and from the perspective of the halachas of an oil arai, is telling me that we're allowed to stack up the Sfarim in this manner, and we don't have to worry about the fact that we're creating an oil arai. Brings up the Mishnah Berurah, when it comes to a question of stacking Sfarim in different ways, sometimes you're not allowed to do it. Forget Hilchos Shabbos. You're not allowed to do it because it's a bezayin HaTorah. So, you're sitting and learning, and for me, for my vision, it is much better for me to have my sefer elevated. So, you want your sefer to be elevated. If it just so happens that there is a sefer on the desk in the perfect position where you could take the Mishnah Berurah and you could rest it on top of that sefer that's on the desk, then apparently even the Taz holds that that's mutter. The problem is for you to go take a sefer, put it into position to use it as a stender. That's a bezayin HaTorah. You see, you have to be very medayik in what the Mishnah Berurah says over here. The Mishnah Berurah says, Oisha sefer atachton munach sham kvar. If the sefer that you want to use as the support was munach sham kvar, if it was already there, then the Taz doesn't answer it. And that's very meduyik in the Taz. The Taz over here in Shin Tesvav, Arachaim Shin Tesvav, sends you to a Taz in Yeridei Shin Pei Beis. And in the Taz in Yeridei Shin Pei Beis, it's very clear that the bezayin HaTorah that the Taz is worried about is going and getting a sefer to use it as a support. It's not so much the using the sefer as the support. If the sefer is there and you want to rest your sefer on it, that the Taz seems to be okay with. The problem is you went and you got the sefer and you put the sefer there to be a support. That's a bezayin HaTorah. Because the Taz says you could have gotten a block of wood for the same price. Why'd you go get a sefer? So you're going to take a sefer to use it as a support? That's a problem. The sefer is there on your desk and you want to rest another sefer on it? That's okay. So from the Taz. Okay. Let's go weiter. It's so hard for me to try and moderate the use of my voice. By nature, I just, I kind of push with my voice, and I have to make sure that we can make it through the rest of the year, so I'll try to hold myself back. Okay. Now, the Ramah told us that the reason the Mechaber is matir stacking the Svarim, and he's not concerned about the creation of an oil arai, in the words of the Ramah, Hoyel ve'ein tzarich la'avish etachtein, because in this case there is no point whatsoever to the gap that is being roofed over. Says the Mishnah is cut lamed aleph, Hoyel ve'ein tzarich. Bizatam, this is a pelodik of Mishnah Berurah, and I'll point out the problem with the Mishnah Berurah, but unfortunately, to resolve the question on the Mishnah Berurah is something which is really beyond the scope of what we could do in this year. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hoyel ve'ein tzarich. Bizatam, for the same rationale that's given over here by the Ramah. So what's the Ramah saying? The Ramah is saying the reason there's no problem of creating that gap, of roofing over that airspace underneath the top sefer and between the two side svarim, is because there's no tzarich at all for that space. And therefore, this is not a problem of creating an oil arai. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mizatam, for the same reason, and this is not his own, he brings this down from a Taz. Mizatam nami, shari lifrais mappa ala shulchan, you're allowed to spread out a tablecloth on the table, ukitzais hamappa, and the sides of the tablecloth, tuluyos lamata min hashulchan mikol tzad, are going to drape over the sides of the table on all four sides of the table, va'afilu imagios smuchais la'aretz. Even if the sides of the tablecloth are going to drape over the sides of the table on all four sides and go almost all the way down to the ground, within 3 tvachim of the ground. So you say sheer lavud and it's closed off. So just picture this in your mind. You have a 10-foot dining room table, 42 inches wide, standard width for a dining room table. Now you're taking the tablecloth, you're draping it over the table, and the tablecloth is going to hang over the table on all four sides and go all the way down to the floor. So now what have you done? You have walled in the area underneath the table. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is mutter. Why is it mutter? Because of the Ramah that we just learned. Okay, let's see the words of the Mishnah Berurah. De'ein bazeh mishum oil. There's no problem over here of creating an oil. Kevin de'ein tzarich la'avish etachas hashulchan. Because you're not using the space under the table. We've said this already many times. The area under a table is not an area that's expected to be used. So this is a case, says the Mishnah Berurah, of creating an oil over a gap that has no purpose. It's like the 3 svarim. There's no purpose to that gap that's under the top sefer between the two sides svarim. So to over here, you threw a tablecloth over the table. It draped over the table on all four sides. It walled in the area under the table. Big deal. That's an area she'ein bo shom tzarich. There's no need for that area. Kevin de'ein tzarich la'avish etachas hashulchan. Okay, v'oid, and furthermore, says the Mishnah Berurah, Kevin shemashem munach al hashulchan, there's another reason this is mutter. You're spreading out the tablecloth on top of the table, right? Kevin shemashem munach al hashulchan, ein by mishum oil. When you put the tablecloth on top of the table, are you creating a horizontal roof? No, you're not roofing over anything. The tablecloth is laying directly on top of the horizontal surface of the table. The area underneath the table is already roofed over by the table. So the top horizontal part of the tablecloth is not a new roof. Essentially, when you spread out the tablecloth, you're not creating a roof. You're creating mechitzos. You're walling in the area underneath the table, but you're not creating a roof. The roof was already there. She'ein sham chalal beinay l'shulchan. There's no space between the tablecloth and the tabletop, so it's not a roof. Mutar gama yotzi mimenu. Therefore, the sides of the tablecloth that drape down also can't be considered a roof. So, again, let's describe the scenario and let's do the math. What are you doing here? You've got a table. The area under the table is roofed over by the tabletop. You're taking a tablecloth, you're spreading it out, and you're letting the sides drape over on all four sides and go all the way down to the floor. So somebody in shul knows that you are a Dirshu Mishnah Berurah devotee. So they come to you to ask you this shaila. Are you holding in Shin Tes Vav? What do you say to this shaila? Am I allowed to put the tablecloth over the table? Okay, let's do the math. Are you creating a roof? No. You're not roofing over anything. The tabletop is the roof. You're not creating a roof. Okay. What are you creating? You're creating mechitzos. Okay. Are the mechitzos kva? No. The mechitzos harai. What's the look of mechitzos harai? Well, mechitzos harai, we learned in Sif Aleph, v'daf gagag, aval mechitzos mutter. It's mutter to create mechitzos harai on Shabbos without a gag. So, exactly what sad iser is there here? There doesn't seem to be. Why is the Mishnah Berurah giving us this ice cotton limud aleph? I don't need a heter to do this. There doesn't seem to be any tzad to answer this. First of all, for the reason I just told you, you're not creating an oil at all. The oil is pre-existing. It's the tabletop. All you're creating is mechitzos harai. Mechitzos harai amutter. Now, even if somehow you want to conjure up an idea that the horizontal plane of the tablecloth does constitute some kind of an oil, but what did you do here? You did it from the top down. You did oil, the horizontal plane of the tablecloth, and then you did mechitzos, the vertical plane of the sides of the tablecloth. So did you do it kisidron? No, you didn't do it kisidron. You were meshana. You did roof first, wall second. So this is a very difficult Mishnah Berurah. To make matters worse, there is actually an opinion that holds that this is usher. I think it's an Berurah who says that this is usher. So, again, this is a very, very shver Mishnah Berurah. There are answers to the questions that are beyond the scope of what we do here. Moving along to Sif Ches, 3 lines down, says the Mechaber. Kol ayel meshupa, a sloped roof, she'ein begagoy tefach, where at the peak of the roof you do not have a width of a tefach. So, there's something I could use other than a sefer. It would be mutter to use a sefer because it's for limud HaTorah. But if I have something that I could use other than a sefer, I'll use something other than a sefer. So here we have a construct. Here we have, let's say, a sloped roof. Let's imagine that this is a sloped roof, okay? And at the peak of the roof up here, you don't have a vertical plane that's the width of a tefach. Okay, let's say, it's not going to work. You know what? I am going to use a sefer for this because a sefer is going to illustrate the point better. Here we have our sloped roof. Okay? This is the peak. Now, let's say the peak came to a point. Over here, it comes to a vertical surface here, a horizontal surface. Let's say at the peak, this horizontal surface is less than a tefach. So maybe there is a little bit of a horizontal ridge over here. But let's say that the horizontal ridge over here is less than 1 tefach wide. That's the first case here of the Mechaber. Kol oyel b'shupa. A sloped or peaked roof, she'ein begagoy tefach, where at its peak you don't have a horizontal width of a tefach. And furthermore, v'loy b'pachus mishloisha samuch legagoy roichav tefach. Not only do you not have a horizontal width of a pesach over here, but were you to go down from the peak, okay? Go down from the peak over here. Go down 3 tvachim. As long as you don't have a width of 3 tvachim, of 1 tefach, within 3 tvachim of the peak, okay? So let's say the upper level of my ruler is 3 tvachim off of the peak. If at this point you don't have a width of a tefach, so you don't have a tefach up here, and you don't even have a tefach down here. You don't have a tefach of a width. Hareze oil arai. That automatically is an oihel arai. Once you don't have a horizontal width of a tefach, and you don't have it at the top, but forget at the top, you don't even have it within 3 tvachim, right? Because the width is getting wider as we go down because of the slope. So as we go down, the width is getting wider and wider. But you don't even have a width of a tefach within 3 tvachim of the peak. Automatically, that's an oil arai, and therefore, were somebody to build a structure with a roof of this type on Shabbos, potter. It would be potter aval aser. It would be an issa d'Rabbanan. It can't be an issa d'Oraisa. Once you don't have that tefach width, it could no longer be an oil d'Oraisa. At most, it could only be an oil d'Rabbanan. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katlan base, Kal Oihel. Hainu afilu asoy lekeva sheyiskayim kama yomim. Even if you were to put up such an oihel, and you were to do it with some level of permanence, even if you are to put up a structure with this kind of sloped roof that should remain in place for several days, nevertheless, since you don't have a horizontal width of a tefach at the peak, automatically it's only an oil arai. In order for a roof to be considered an oil kva, it has to have more than a 1 tefach width. The Mechaber gave us this case in the context of a sloped roof. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it doesn't really have to be a sloped roof. The same halach is going to apply to a flat roof. Even if you made some kind of a construct that had a flat roof, you're also not going to be over an issa d'Oraisa. You're not going to be chayiv unless the width of the flat roof is at least a tefach. Because less than a tefach, it cannot be considered an oil. Why did the Mechaber talk about a sloped roof? Mishum Seifa. Only because of the next case in the Mechaber. The only reason the Mishnah Berurah gave this to the Mechaber gave this to us in the context of a slope roof is to tell us his second halacha, that when it comes to a sloped roof, we're also going to measure 3 tvachim down off the peak. And if at 3 tvachim down off the peak, you do have a width of a tefach, that's going to be problematic. What does this mean? Right? That it doesn't reach a width of a tefach until you go more than 3 tvachim down off of the peak. But if you do end up with a horizontal width of more than a tefach within 3 tvachim of the peak, then we look at it as if there is a roof of a tefach. Why? Because of limud. Because if at this lower height, let's say that's 2.5 tvachim off the peak, if at that point you had a width of a tefach, what would we say? We would say limud. We would say that from point A to point B, since it's less than 3 tvachim, is considered closed by a horizontal line. And that horizontal line would constitute a gag, an oil, of at least a tefach wide. Ois kadlam dalid. An oil mishupa she'ein begagu tefach. Avalim yesh begagu tefach. But if you do have a roof of at least a tefach wide, chashiv oil kva v'chayiv. Constructing such an oil would be considered an oil kva, and that would be this d'Oraisa. Now, where does this come from? That an oil that's a 1 tefach wide constitutes an oil that's so significant that it would be an issa d'Oraisa to construct it on Shabbos. Shekein matzino ale toma tefach. This comes from the halachas of tumas oil by tumas mace. We know that if there's a mace under a roof, it brings tumah to everything else that's under the same roof. What constitutes a roof? It has to be at least a tefach wide. Certainly, in order for it to be an issa daraisa, it has to be made for permanence. Avala arai, but if it's only an oil arai, if you just put up a fabric, piece of fabric on top of 4 poles, even if it's many tfachim wide, that's an oil arai. That's what we've been speaking about since the beginning of Shimon Tesvav. That's an oil arai. I don't care how big it is. Moving along to Mishnah Berurah's Katan Lamed Hey, Potter. The Mechaber said that in this case where you do not have a gag tefach, the lashon of the Mechaber was Potter. So the Mishnah Berurah reminds us, Potter hainu mechatas. Potter, exempt, means that one who does this is Potter for being a karmel chatas because this is not an issa daraisa. Aval asur midrabanan. However, don't be confused. Don't think the Mechaber is saying that whenever you don't have a horizontal plane of a tefach, wherever you don't have a gag tefach, this is mutter to do on Shabbos. It's potter, not mutter. It's also midrabanan gezerah atu oil kva, because in essence, the lack of a gag tefach reduces this from an issa daraisa to an issa darabanan, but it's still an issa darabanan of an oil arai, right? The lack of the horizontal plane of a tefach automatically reduces it from an oil kva to an oil arai, but it's still an oil arai, and oil arai, we've been learning a lot of halachas here of oil arai. Oil arai can be also midrabanan gzera atu oil kva. Vayin b'Magen Avram, the Mishnah Berurah sends us to the Magen Avram. Shekol zehu l'das harif v'harambam. This is the shita of the Rif and the Rambam. Aval l'das Rashi, but according to shitas Rashi v'harosh, kevan she'en b'gag tefach. So according to the Rif and the Rambam, the lack of the gag tefach reduces it from an oil kfa to an oil arai. However, according to Rashi and the Rosh, kevan she'en b'gag tefach, the lack of a gag tefach, loy choshev oil klal. According to Rashi and the Rosh, when you don't have a gag tefach, it's not an oil at all, not even an oil arai, or mutar lechatchila. However, the Shulchan Aruch is following the shita of the Rif and the Rambam. V'cheinu gam kein das Rabbeinu Chananel. Uber Prima Godim Mitzadeh, the Prima Godim takes the position, the Gam Rashi v'Rosh Moidulo das Rambam bazeh. According to the Prima Godim, he says that Rashi and the Rosh agree to the Rambam, Kevin Chasoy L'Kva, that certainly if you made a construct that had a gag less than a tefach, but you did it L'Kva, you did it sheyiskayim zman kama yomim, that it's something that should stand for several days, even Rashi would agree that that is at least an ayal arai. Okay, let's go to Sif Tes. Sif Tes is going to bring us to another little bit of show and tell. Okay. Says the Mechaber, Mishameres, a strainer, Shetoilen Oisa, that you suspend over a keli, Loses Bashmarim, in order to place into it dregs of wine sediment or wine dregs, Lisaninon, so that you could strain them, Umoischin Piha Lechol Tzad, and you spread out the open end of the strainer material around all the sides of the keli, Choshev Asiyas Oil, this is the creation of an oil arai, va'asr lin toisa, you are not allowed to suspend the strainer in this fashion. What are we talking about here? So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah Mishameres. We're talking about a strainer. Venera. It seems to me, says the Mishnah Berurah, the also kimin sak, this is something, it's a material that essentially is formed into a sack. Shekarin loigenzak. In Yiddish it would be called a loigenzak. V'hu rachav, it's wide, upasuach, and open, lamayla, at the top. V'sosum, and it's closed, v'chadud, and it is pointed, lamata, at the bottom. Umachnisin ktsei chadud b'saych hakeli. And you take the pointy end and you put it inside a keli. V'hakatza ha'elyain harachav, and the upper wide open part, Misabevim besfas piu esakli. You put it around the open top of the keli. V'nimtzehu gag lakli. So now the straining sack essentially forms a roof over the interior of the keli. V'asik oil. This is forming an oil arai. V'asim midrabanan, and it is asim midrabanan. What are we talking about here? Okay, let's see. Keli. Keli is opened at the top. Mishameres. This is the straining sack. This happens to be a coffee filter for a pour-over coffee maker. I like my coffee. I need my coffee. Okay, what are you doing? You're taking the straining sack, which is pasuach v'rochov lamayla, in the words of the Mishnah Berurah. It is wide and it is open at the top. V'chodud v'sasam lamata. It's closed and relatively pointy at the bottom. Umachnizid taicha keli. You put it inside the keli, right? Umoischin espia, and you stretch out the top. The top goes around the entire rim of the keli. If you want, really, what they used to do apparently was they would fold it over, which I'm going to do now. So now I have folded over the top over the rim of the keli. So you can see the closed pointy end over there at the bottom. Here's the big open wide top. Now essentially this filter or strainer is forming an oil. It's forming a roof over the interior of the keli. Now, let's do the math. Keli. I take this keli. Now, we're talking really about a chavis. We're not talking about a cup. So I'm illustrating to you with a small cup. But let's imagine a barrel, a wine barrel. Now, on Shabbos, I take the wine barrel. I pick it up from location A, and I put it down in location B. When I put that chavis down on the ground in location B, what I have just done is I have erected mechitzos, because the walls of the chavis are the walls that surround the bottom area. So I made my mechitzos when I put down the chavis. Now I'm going to take the mishameres and I'm going to put it inside the chavis and stretch it out around the top. Now I made my oil. So I just constructed an oil arai on Shabbos, and I did it kisidron. I did it in the proper order. I made the mechitzos, and then I made the top. And remember, there's one more variable, and there's a tzorich, there's a need for the area down below. Because if I'm straining something, that's where the liquid is going to gather, in the area below. So I have all the variables that I need here for an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's an oil arai. It's not osi lahagein. It's not made for shelter purposes. That's why I need mechitzos. But I made mechitzos, and I did it kisidron. I made the mechitzos first when I put down the chavis. I made the oil second when I put in the mishameres. And there's a need for the area that's being roofed over, because that's where the strained liquid is going to collect. Presto. It's an oil arai that presents an Issa D'Rabbanan. Now, some of you might be thinking about what we learned in Siv Ches. And that is, wait a second, there's no gag tefach. Where is there a gag tefach? Essentially, this is an inverted sloped roof, right? If I hold it up this way, aside from looking like a witch's hat, it looks like it's an inverted sloped roof. And you don't have a horizontal plane of a tefach up here. But so what? That only makes that it's an oil arai, not an oil kva. The isser that we're dealing with over here is an oil arai isser. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's an oil arai that's not osi lahagein, but there are mechitzas. I built it kisidron, and there's a tzorich for the area, the open area that's being sheltered over. All of that equals an isser midrabanan, and that's why the Mechaber said asar lim toisa. Let's finish off the Mishnah Berurah over here. But were you to take the mishameres and not insert it into the cup, if you hung it on top of some kind of a frame, so there are no mechitzos, Says the Mishnah Berurah, Aval litlaisamishamerski shtuch aleis yaseid ubali klitachter with no keli under it mutter. That would be mutter. Da'afilo oil arai lo choshev, because it wouldn't be considered an oil arai. I assume he means because there's no mechitzas. V'choshkein the mutter litlais kli biyaseid, and kolshkein the mutter litlais kli biyaseid. Kolshkein the mutter litlais kli biyaseid. Okay, I'm not sure what that means. Stay tuned till tomorrow. I'll find out what that means. Let me look into that. I forgot what that means. I think what he means is that since we just spoke about a case where you're allowed to take the mishameres and hang it on a frame without mechitzas underneath, so to take a keli, let's say this is your chavis, and you want to put it down on a yaseid, maybe he's saying that that's mutter, because again, this would be an oil arai that you're erecting shaloi keseder. You're not putting up the mechitzas first and then putting up the gag. In a sense, you're doing it from the top down, because the gag is already here. The mechitzas don't become mechitzas until they go down, at least within 3 tvachim of the karka, I guess. But you'd be making it out of order. I think that's what it means, but I will check to make sure that I'm right. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shem should send Yeshua Sefuris Parnasat Sheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeich to see the BS Gal Tzedek B'meher V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.